7, Lesson 3, where we actually start to get into ADO.NET for the first time. Unfortunately, as I think I warned you at the beginning of the book, I wasn't able to get ADO.NET to work worth a darn with SQL with SQL Server 2008 Express Edition. So I'm going to have to switch over to Visual Studio 2008 and SQL Server 2005, the full-blown edition you pay money for, in order to continue with the book. But one of the first things we want to look at is hidden objects, or the concept of hidden objects. We're not actually going to need to go into them in this lesson. In later lessons we will. But an example of hidden objects in programming are the SQL connection, SQL command, and SQL data reader, which are all part of the system.data.sql client namespace, which we'll get into when we start actually writing programs with ADO.NET. This lesson we're just going to be using the GUI for ADO.NET, the IDE. And the GUI will generate hidden objects for us. In fact, we won't even realize they're there unless we look at something at the bottom of the screen called a component tray, and we'll see that these hidden objects got created. But three of the hidden objects involved with the GUI, and especially with this lesson, which is the DataGridView control, are the binding source, the table adapter, and the data set. This is a diagram that shows how these hidden objects relate to each other. Basically, the data set is a copy of the database, a local copy of the database in your C# program. And what's great about that is it gets copied over, and then essentially the program disconnects from the probably TCP IP or whatever connection you have hooking up to the database, maybe name pipe or whatever. So it can work on the data entirely locally, which saves you a lot of connection time and bandwidth, which becomes important when you're using a multi-user system especially. So we have the local copy data set that talks to something called the table adapter. And basically the table adapter sends requests to the database. Like if you change something in the data set, obviously you're going to need to reconnect and change it in the remote database as well, so the two look the same. You know, you don't want them to get out of sync. So the table adapter sends requests actually to another hidden object called the binding source. And the binding source also doesn't talk directly to the database. What the binding source talks to is something called the provider, which is for every type of database. Like you have SQL Server, you have Access, you have Oracle, you have Informix. There's a lot of different databases. And every database that wants to be usable by ADO.NET needs to supply, along with their database, a provider, so that the provider in effect is a translator. The binding source sends commands that are always the same, and the provider receives those commands and then translates them into the commands that are understandable by the remote database. So the provider actually takes things that might be radically different and makes them all look the same in terms of the binding source provider interface. It's actually a pretty common idea. The Microsoft themselves are using it with multiple different machines in their MSIL, intermediate language. And in effect, you have a language that looks like every language, and that language then gets translated into the actual individual languages, which that translation's a lot easier than going from the original English, you know, because the language, or the P code or the byte code or whatever they're calling it, that it's translated into is a lot closer to all the individual languages. understands database thinking, so to speak. So now that we've discussed the hidden objects, specifically the ones involved with the GUI and the IDE generated hidden objects, I just need to mention again that I'm switching to Visual Studio 2008 and SQL Server 2005, and that's on a computer called Rose. I mention that because you'll start seeing these names cropping up when I do things like define interfaces. So the computer I've been doing most of these lessons on is named Lana, and the one we're switching to is named Rose. And the application we're going to create is a DataGridView, which displays the table we created in an earlier lesson of the Buffy cast in the Buffy the Vampire show. And one of the first things we need to do in order to do that is go into a SQL Server and create a user just for the application. And the reason we need to do that is security reasons, because we want something that interfaces with the Buffy database and the Buffy table, but can't access our other tables like our system table. So we don't want to use the system administrator user and password and have a potential for malicious users to start messing up our database. So we create an application limited user in SQL Server, and then we create a DataGridView application in Visual Studio and add the DataGridView control to the form. And then finally we need to bind something called a data source to the DataGridView. And what this lesson mainly is about really is what the data source is and how to create the data source. And unfortunately I'm going to have to do that on Rose, and Rose is a Vista oriented computer, and the screen capture software I'm using is Cam Studio, which is free, the free version. And Cam Studio doesn't work at all on Vista, but there's a beta version of Cam Studio that does work. Unfortunately, capturing sound doesn't work. So I'm going to have to capture the what I'm doing on Rose silently, like the old silent movies, and then I'll play what I captured on my media library player on Lana and narrate it. So it'll be like we're watching TV together and I'm talking through the whole program. Alright. We're now playing Rose on Lana. Unfortunately, the screen is slightly bigger than the capture rectangle, but basically what I'm showing you here is we're going into Visual Studio 2008 and SQL Server 2005, and I'm logging on with SA and the SA password using SQL Server Authentication rather than the Windows authentication we've been using up to this time. This is the Object Explorer and the and there we see with our Buffy's DB database that we created in a previous lesson, and our Buffy's cast table that we created in a previous lesson that I actually brought over to Rose via .SQL file, which I ran as a new query on the new query button. I hope this is coming out alright because it's a little weird. This is actually the .SQL file I used to create the database and the table, and to populate the table with the same data we saw before. A major difference you'll notice in this .SQL file from the version for 2008 is that I have to have a separate insert into for every insert on the table, whereas I can just have multiple records inserted with one insert into with 2008. That was kind of an advance in 2008. Unfortunately, we're going back in time in order to get this to work. And the next thing I want you to look at is the security tab under the Buffy's DB database, and then the user item under that, and it'll show all the users that have the right to access the Buffy's DB database. And what we want to do is create a new user with very limited access. We just want them to have the access that we need in order to do what we want to do in the ADO.NET program. So we go down to another security tab that's outside of the database. It's a security tab for the whole system. And there's an item called logins. And what we want to do is create a new login. So we right click on logins and select new login. And then we have a new login wizard that appears, and we want to use SQL Authentication, so we select that radio button, and then we'll just call the user Buffy and keep everything consistent. And I'm creating a password for Buffy called Slayer, and then you need to confirm the password. And then there's a couple checkboxes we want to get rid of because we're not actually using this user to log in, so we don't want them to have to change the password next login, and we don't want to force password expiration, because we want this to be usable with ADO.NET for as long as we use it. And we want to change the default database to Buffy's DB. And what I should have done at this point is I should have gone over to another tab that says what user mappings do I want, which means what databases and tables do I want this user to access. But I forgot to do that. So I'm going back down and I'm clicking properties, and which reopens editing that same wizard. And I'm going to user mappings, and I go over in the database I want to map this user to is Buffy's DB, so I click on that checkbox. And then these are the accesses that the user can have, and the only accesses we really need is data writer and data reader. In fact, we don't even need data writer, because this specific program we're not even writing to the database, but I usually click on those two together. So click OK. And one thing that doing that user mapping should do is it should now create that user within Buffy, within the Buffy's DB database. And if you go back up to the Buffy's DB database and then back to the security and users items, you'll see that under them now is the user Buffy. So that has indeed been created. Now we exit out of SQL Server and come back into Visual Studio 2008. And the first thing we want to do is create a new project. So we've actually done this a number of times before in the course of the book, assuming you're doing it in order in the book and not just watching it on YouTube. But you click File, New, and Project. And then within Visual Studio, there's a lot more options. As usual, we want to change the name of the program to be something meaningful, like DataGridView. But there's actually several languages you can select. We already have C# selected, but you can do Visual Basic and a number of other languages too. And then we want to make sure the template we're using is the Windows form application, because once again we're creating a form in this case, one that interfaces with the database. And once that's all set correct, go over and click OK. Oh, another point I wanted to make was that I pre-created a database to put all these projects in. In this case, I called it Rose 2005. But if you hadn't done that, you could click the Browse button and select a directory to put the working files in. Okay, we've clicked OK, and our usual display with the form predefined for us pops up. And we definitely want to expand this form to be bigger, because we want to essentially to have an XY table on the form that'll display the data from the Buffy's cast table. And first thing we need to do is add a new data source. And a data source is something saved inside the project that allows us to access data in various media. And the media we want to select, of course, is database. And click Next. And you see there's already a connection called Buffy's db.dbo, rose.buffys.db.dbo. And so I already actually created this, but I'm going to recreate it again to show you how to do it. And first thing you need to select is the server name. Well, actually, you need to specify what they call a data source here, which is what I showed as the provider in that diagram previously. And in this case, we definitely want it to be Microsoft SQL Server, or SQL Client, as it's known for short. And we want that to we want the server to be Rose, and we want to use SQL Server Authentication, and we want to use our limited access user, our application limited access user, Buffy, with the password as Slayer for this. And click on Remember the Password so that it won't keep prompting the user for a password. And then select the database we want, which is Buffy's DB, our limited access user, our application limited access user, Buffy, with the password as Slayer for this. And click on Remember the Password so that it won't keep prompting the user for a password. And then select the database we want, which is Buffy's DB. Actually, the only database that user can access anyhow. Anything else will give you an error. And click on Test Connection to see if that connection works. And hallelujah, it does. A message box pops up that says, yeah, you can use that connection. Click OK. And then we want to say yes, include sensitive data in the connection string. I think that also will prompt the user if you don't say that. I'm not sure. But we want to expand out what gets generated, which is called the connection string, because this is sort of the magic words needed to interface between ADO and the database. So click on that and copy it into the clipboard, and then save that somewhere, because we'll be using that in later lessons, especially when we're writing programs in ADO.NET, actually writing code. So I copied that and pasted it into a notepad, and then I saved it into like a notes file that's more permanent than just a temporary notepad. But I'm just sort of demonstrating the idea here. And see, it says data source, initial catalog, which is a database, persistent security information, and I had the Buffy user and password. And then click Next. And it says it wants to name the connection Buffy's DB connection string. You can change that if you want, but that seems like a fine name. So click Next. And then it retrieves the database information. It's actually going out to the database based on what we told it. and getting information about what we ask about. And it allows us to choose the database objects we want. And for DataGridView, what we want to do is display the whole table. So I just click on the table name and it selects all the columns within that table. And we're pretty much done, so click Finish. It takes a minute or two to do this. Now we're back in our Visual Studio and our form and so on. And what we want to do at this point is drag a control over to the form. And so far we've been working with controls in a section called Common Controls, such as buttons and list boxes and text boxes and so on. But this control we want is actually in a section called Data. And the name of the control is the DataGridView. So click on that, hold down the left mouse button and drag it over to the form. And a DataGridView appears. And a pop-up menu also appears. If you look closely, there's a little arrow up in the upper right-hand corner of the control. And this box is actually expanded off that arrow. And what we want to choose for a data source is what we just created, the data source we just created. So select Other Data Sources and Project Data Sources. And then we'll see the Buffy's DB dataset and the Buffy's cast table. What we want is the Buffy's cast table, because the dataset can have a lot of other information in it too. It's a local copy of the database, as I mentioned at the beginning. And a couple things we want to possibly get rid of is enabling editing and enabling deleting, but it doesn't really matter because we're just using this to demonstrate an ADO connection to a SQL Server database from C#. So expand the control out so it's big enough that we can see it. And we only have 5 records, so there shouldn't be any problem with displaying the whole table on this DataGridView. So, but expand that down so we know it'll get all 5 records. And we're almost done, really. Click the Save button. And then we want to compile and run the program. And previously in the Express version we only had debug. But in this we can say debug or release. And release will create a much smaller program, but it won't have debug information for stepping through it. But we might as well be overconfident and go with release and create the smaller program size for the .exe. So right now we're compiling in an exe, we're running it, and voila, there it is. We have our whole table displayed, basically without writing any code, basically with just creating a data source and dragging over a DataGridView and putting it on the hooking the data source to the DataGridView via that small area, which is usually referred to as the common task pop-up. But one thing that bothered us when we initially did this is that occupation column wasn't big enough to show the full occupation. So I'm going into a Keystone Cop section of this program where I'm trying to figure out how to make that column big enough so that occupation displays fully. And just expanding out the control didn't work. As a user, if I'm running the program, I can click on the DataGrid control and expand it out, but we don't want the user to have to do that every time. We want it to auto expand. So once again, I'm somewhat thrashing about trying to find a solution. And what I really want, actually if I would have clicked on edit columns here, I could have solved it. I don't know if I do that. I don't think I do. I think I click on preview data. And that then basically doesn't do anything. It shows the data and shows it doesn't fit. And it shows I can drag it to get it to fit, but the dragging that in the preview doesn't change anything. It just shows that, well, the user will have to drag that too. I'm previewing the user's problems here. So I'm saving it and I'm recompiling it to see if that solved the problem, and sure enough it didn't. They're still too small for the system. So I say, well, what I really need, what that really is a property of the control. So what I really need is the properties pane. So no, actually I go into edit columns. Yes. Actually I found the solution by using the common task. I don't think I directly used the common task arrow, but I right clicked on the control and got to essentially the same display as the common task arrow. And I go to Autosize mode, which definitely sounds like it'd be the right thing, and I say Autosize all cells, and I say OK. And so hopefully this will cause it to expand automatically to show the full occupation. I click save and recompile and run, and sure enough that does cause it to automatically expand to show the whole occupation. But then I go, what if Jonathan Rumpelstiltskin or Jonathan Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious decides to be entered in a database, and that should auto expand too. So what I want to really do is do the same thing for all the different fields. But if I look at first name, the Autosize mode is about how to get the properties pane to come back. Windows isn't it. So I say forget about that. And I remember view largely allows you to select things like that. So I go to, and that view is right. So I select the properties window, but the properties window comes up all wrong. I don't know how I got this IDE so messed up, but the properties window is like floating around and I can't get it to go back into a standard position. This is me trying to get it to go back into a standard position, and it remains irritatingly crummy. So I remember there's a command under Windows it said reset form or reset all palettes or something like that. So I'm about to go over and click on that, and that'll actually reposition everything correctly. But I think the properties pane is still not there. So even after I do that, I have to reselect the properties pane. I realize this is painful to watch, but in a way it's a good example of what you have to do to get a program to work. You got to get the IDE to work before you can get the program to work. I know I can do it. Go down to reset window layout. That's it. That says, are you sure you want to restore the default environment? And I do. But then I go over and the property pane isn't there again. So I go over to view again and I reselect the property pane. Or eventually it's going to dawn on me to do that. Here we go. Project view, there we go. Reselect the property window. And now it looks, the IDE looks the way I want it to look. It's got the Solution Explorer and the properties window on top of each other the way they standardly are. So the reset windows in the Windows control was the main secret of getting that to work right. And so I'd look for a generic auto-size columns, and there is one. And so I say auto-size all cells. And I thought this would automatically resize all cells. It certainly looked like it would for the data grid, and maybe it does. Maybe it does. But I got insecure about it. I recompile and rerun it, and it's working because it was working before. I still don't have a really long last name or anything in there. But I X out of this, and then because I'm insecure about it, I'm going to go back and check whether indeed all the columns are set to auto set. So I click on the common task pop-up, and I go down to the Autosize mode for first name, and it's still not set. It's still not set for gender, age, last name, still only set for occupation. And that could just mean that I didn't explicitly set it in the columns. But because it's generically set, it'll still work. But I got insecure about it, and I just went back and reset it for all the columns, because I for sure want it to expand. You know, it's set for all cells in the generic property for the control down in the properties window. And now I'm scrolling through the properties window to try and find if there's some other generic property that'll reset that and I'll actually see it. But I couldn't find any. This is kind of weird because it's watching myself in the past. And so I go up. As I say, I probably will work the way I have it. I think it'll probably work the way I have it with that generically set for the control. But just in case, I reset it to auto size mode for all cells for first name. Then I reset it to auto size mode for all cells for last name. And then I reset it to auto size mode for age and gender, which is kind of ridiculous because age is never going to be over 3 digits, except perhaps for Anya, who actually is over 1,000 years old, since this is a Buffy's cast table. But gender is only going to be 1 character, so I probably didn't need to reset those. But you know, being a compulsive personality is part of the job. And then I go down to the component tray, what's called a component tray at the bottom of the screen. And you can see that there's those 3 hidden objects I was talking about. The table adapter, Buffy's cast table adapter, Buffy's cast binding source, and Buffy's DB dataset. So those indeed are the 3 hidden objects I was talking about at the beginning of the lesson. And they are indeed there and are what are causing this to work, interacting with each other. Well, this was kind of a strange way to do this, but we indeed accomplished everything that was on our list to do. So I'll select everything and go up and click Done. And that more or less completes the lesson. I'm sorry about things getting so weird and that I'm having to play rows on my media library player. I wrote Media Library Player, by the way, as you know if you've gone to the website. I wrote 2 versions, one for the website, one web-oriented and one local computer-oriented. And we're just looking at the local computer-oriented version of it. But I wrote it in PHP and MySQL, not in C#. But at any case, this completes the lesson for ADO.NET, Chapter 7, Lesson 3. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I hope that you go over and visit my website at www.dougteaches.com. I display that in several places on YouTube, so you should be able to find it. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson and learned from it. I'm sorry about having to do it this way, but it's really limitations of Vista that's causing me to have to do it this way, and limitations of SQL Server Express, I think. It could always be limitations of my own knowledge, but I think my knowledge would allow me to do it if it were straightforward. Well, I hope you enjoyed the lesson, as I say, and as always, focus and learn a lot.